Hey folks, before the video starts, please leave a like and subscribe to cheer me up. Make sure you are relaxed and enjoy today's stories. I interviewed a man on the deep web that cannot die. Alright, so this is probably going to sound completely insane, but bear with me here. I've spent a lot of time reading deep web horror stories and weird internet mysteries, but I never thought I'd be a part of one myself. This happened about 6 months ago, and I've been debating whether to post this or not. Honestly, it still creeps me out to even think about it, but I need to get it off my chest. So, here it goes. To give you a bit of background, I've always been a bit of an internet junkie. I like exploring the darker corners of the web, not for anything too sketchy, more out of curiosity. The deep web, with its endless rumors of black markets and secretive chat rooms, always intrigued me. But let me be clear, I wasn't looking to buy illegal stuff or anything like that. I was more interested in those urban legends, stuff like red rooms or weird, cryptic websites that allegedly exist. One night, I was messing around in a deep web forum that I'd found a few weeks before. It was mostly dead links and people talking about conspiracy theories, nothing too exciting. But then, I got a direct message from someone with the username nullanon. Now, you hear a name like that, and you already know it's probably not going to be good news. Still, curiosity got the better of me, so I opened it. The message was short, just one line. I know you're looking for something interesting. How about an interview with a man who can't die? I'm not going to lie. I laughed at first. Obviously, this had to be a joke. I mean, seriously, someone who can't die. What is this? Some kind of creepypasta bait? But something about the wording stuck with me. The way it was phrased. It wasn't trying to be spooky or mysterious. It was just blunt, straightforward. It was like whoever this person was, they were making an offer. Now this is where I probably should have just stopped, deleted the message, and moved on. But instead, I replied with, "What are you talking about?" It didn't take long to get a response. I almost wish it had, so I could have had more time to think about what I was getting into. If you're interested, I'll send you a link. You can meet him yourself. That was it. No explanation, no elaborate backstory. Just the promise of some weird link. I could have ignored it, closed my laptop, and pretended I never saw it. But like an idiot, I replied with, "Sure, send the link." Within minutes, a message popped up with a URL. It wasn't a normal website link either. It was one of those weird, deep web addresses. Just a string of random letters and numbers, the kind that makes you feel like you're about to stumble into something you shouldn't. Before I clicked it, I hesitated. I remember staring at the link for a solid minute, my finger hovering over the trackpad. Something about this felt wrong, but it was like I couldn't stop myself. It's that same feeling you get when you're watching a scary movie and you know the character's about to do something stupid, but you can't look away. Yeah, it was like that. So, I clicked it. The page that loaded was incredibly basic, almost like it had been thrown together in 5 minutes. There was nothing on it but a black screen with a chat box in the middle. Above the box, a line of text appeared, one word at a time. "Welcome. The interview will begin shortly. Please wait." I didn't know what to expect. Part of me thought it was just going to be some troll messing with me, maybe a jump scare, or some weird deep web prank. But a few minutes later, a video feed popped up. The first thing I noticed was that the lighting was all wrong. It wasn't like a regular webcam setup. It was way too dim, with this harsh light casting long shadows on the walls. Whoever was in the room had set it up like that on purpose, for sure. Then I saw him. The man on the screen looked normal at first. Mid-40s, clean-shaven, with this kind of intense stare. He didn't move for the first few seconds, just stared right into the camera, like he was sizing me up. Finally, he spoke. "You're the one who wanted to talk to me?" I remember nodding, even though I knew he couldn't see me. Then I typed out, "Yeah, I guess so. Are you the guy who can't die?" He smiled, but it wasn't a friendly smile. It was more like the kind of smile you'd get from someone who knows something you don't, and they're enjoying the fact that you're clueless. "Yes," he said. "I've been alive for over 300 years. At this point, I was still convinced this was some kind of prank, like the dude was just trolling me. But the way he spoke, he sounded so calm, so sure of himself. It got under my skin a little. I typed back, "Prove it." And this is where things started to get really weird. He reached off camera for something, and when his hand came back, he was holding a knife. A long, sharp-looking one, with a dull sheen in the dim light. My heart jumped, but I kept telling myself this was all fake, that I was about to get punked. Then, without any hesitation, he brought the knife to his arm and dragged the blade across his skin. I watched as a long, deep cut opened up on his forearm, and blood started pouring out. It didn't look fake. It looked real. Too real. I started to type something, maybe to tell him to stop, but before I could hit enter, I saw something that made my stomach drop. The wound started to heal. Right in front of me, the gash slowly closed itself up, the skin knitting back together as if nothing had happened. The blood that had dripped onto his arm disappeared, absorbed back into his body. Within a minute, there wasn't a single mark left on his skin. He just smiled at the camera, like this was the most normal thing in the world. I was frozen. My hands hovered over the keyboard, but I couldn't think of anything to say. What the hell had I just witnessed? That's when he leaned in closer, his eyes locked onto mine through the screen. "I told you, I can't die." I didn't know what to do. Every instinct was screaming at me to shut the laptop, to walk away, to pretend I had never seen any of this. But I didn't. Instead, I typed back, "How is that possible?" His smile faded. "That's what we're going to talk about. But first, you need to understand something. Once you start this conversation, you won't be able to stop." And for some reason, I believed him. I sat there, staring at the screen, my mind racing. This guy just slashed his arm open, and it healed like nothing had happened. There was no way that was real. No way. But I had seen it with my own eyes. My brain was desperately trying to make sense of it, throwing around explanations like CGI or camera tricks. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. He had said I wouldn't be able to stop once the conversation began. I tried to tell myself I could just close the laptop, walk away, pretend this never happened. But my fingers didn't move. I was glued to the screen, waiting for him to say something else. Finally, he spoke again. "Before we continue, you should know one thing. There are consequences for asking too many questions." The way he said it, calm, matter of fact. It didn't sound like a threat, but it felt like one. My pulse was racing, my palms sweaty on the keyboard, but for some reason, I still typed back. "What kind of consequences?" He leaned back in his chair, and for the first time, I noticed the room behind him. It wasn't much, just dark walls and the faint outline of a wooden desk. But then my eyes caught something in the corner of the screen, something I hadn't noticed before. There was a mirror behind him, hanging crooked on the wall, and in that mirror, I could see part of the room, but something was off. There was no reflection of the man. I blinked, thinking it was some kind of glitch. Maybe the lighting or the angle of the camera was messing with the reflection, but the more I stared, the more it hit me. His chair, the desk, the walls, they were all reflected perfectly, but not him. It was like he wasn't really there. He must have seen me notice, because he smiled again, that same eerie smile. The kind of consequences that make you wish you hadn't asked, but you're already too deep in, so I'll give you the choice. You can walk away now, close this window, and forget everything you've seen. Or you can keep asking questions, but you won't like the answers. I hesitated. Part of me wanted to slam my laptop shut right then and there, but the other part, the part that was way too curious for my own good, wanted to know more. I could feel my fingers trembling as I typed, "Why can't you die?" For a long moment, he didn't respond. He just sat there, his eyes boring into the camera, like he was deciding whether to answer. Then he spoke, and his voice dropped lower, colder. "It's not about why I can't die. It's about how." I leaned in closer to the screen, every muscle in my body tense. I was hanging on his every word, even though every instinct I had was telling me to stop. But he didn't continue right away. He paused, studying me, as if trying to gauge whether I was ready to hear what he had to say. "I made a deal," he finally said. "A long time ago. A deal I thought would solve all my problems." A chill ran down my spine, but I couldn't stop now. I had to know. I had to. "What kind of deal?" His eyes flicked to the mirror behind him, the one where his reflection should have been. For the first time, his smile faltered. "The kind of deal that costs more than you realize. You don't get something for nothing in this world. Or the next." He reached for something off camera again, and this time, when his hand came back, he was holding a small, leather-bound book. It looked old, really old. The edges of the leather were worn, the pages yellowed and curling. He held it up to the camera for a moment, letting me get a good look at it before setting it down in front of him. "This book," he said, "is the reason I can't die. It was given to me by someone, something, that doesn't belong in this world." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. It sounded like something straight out of a horror movie, but the way he said it, it was so calm, so certain, that I started to wonder if maybe, just maybe, he was telling the truth. He opened the book, flipping through the pages slowly, carefully. I tried to make out what was written, but the camera resolution wasn't great, and the text was too small to read. Still, I could see strange symbols and diagrams, things that didn't look like any language I'd ever seen. "When I first found this book," he said, "I was desperate. I was willing to do anything to escape what I was running from. It promised me eternal life, freedom from pain, suffering, and death. All I had to do was follow the instructions." He closed the book, looking back at the camera. His eyes were darker now, more serious. "But there's a catch," he continued. "There's always a catch. Eternal life. It doesn't come without a price. I may not be able to die, but that doesn't mean I'm free." I felt a lump forming in my throat. I wanted to ask him what he meant, but I was too scared of the answer. He must have sensed my hesitation, because he leaned in closer to the camera, his face filling the screen. "You can't outrun what's coming for you. When you make a deal like this, it will find you. no matter where you go, no matter how long it takes. And when it does, death would be a mercy. I swallowed hard, my mouth dry. I was in way over my head, but before I could type anything else, he said something that sent a chill straight down my spine. "You've seen too much now," he said softly. "It's already started. You won't be able to escape it." I froze. What was he talking about? What had started? He didn't give me a chance to ask. The screen suddenly went black, the chat window closing itself without warning. I stared at my laptop, my heart pounding in my chest. I tried refreshing the page, but nothing happened. It was like the website had vanished. For a moment, I just sat there, completely stunned. I tried to convince myself that it was some kind of elaborate prank, maybe a viral marketing stunt or something. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. Something about the whole experience felt too real, too unsettling. Then, as I sat there in the dark, I heard it, a soft tapping sound coming from the window behind me. I turned around slowly, my breath catching in my throat. The room was dark, and at first, I couldn't see anything outside. But then, in the faint light from the street lamp, I saw it. A figure, standing in the shadows, watching me. And suddenly, I knew. Whatever I had gotten myself into, it wasn't over. For a long moment, I couldn't move. My eyes were locked on that figure, outside my window, standing just far enough away that I couldn't make out any details, but close enough that I could feel its eyes on me. My breath hitched, my heart pounding so hard I thought it was going to burst out of my chest. It didn't move, just stood there, in the shadows, watching. I should have gotten up, closed the blinds, turned off the lights, anything, but I couldn't. It was like my body had shut down, frozen in place by the sheer terror of the situation. My mind was racing, trying to come up with explanations, telling myself that maybe it was just some random person outside. Maybe it was just a coincidence. But I knew better. This was no coincidence. The man on the screen, what he'd said about there being consequences, about something already starting. I didn't want to believe it, but that figure outside was making it impossible to deny. This wasn't just some deep web prank. Whatever I'd gotten myself into, it was real. Too real. I don't know how long I sat there, staring at that figure. It could have been seconds. It could have been minutes. Time didn't seem to exist in that moment. But then, without warning, the figure stepped forward, just enough that the light from the street lamp caught its face. Or at least, what should have been its face. I don't know how to describe it, other than to say it wasn't right. It was almost like a face, but warped, stretched, like someone had taken a photograph and twisted it until it barely resembled a human being. The features were all wrong. Eyes too big, mouth too wide, skin too pale. It was like staring at something pretending to be human, but not quite pulling it off. I felt my stomach drop, a wave of nausea washing over me. I couldn't look away, but I needed to. Every instinct was screaming at me to get up, to run, to do anything to get away from that thing. But before I could, it raised a hand, slowly, deliberately, and pressed its palm against the window. I flinched, finally breaking free from whatever trance I was in. My body jerked into action, and I scrambled out of my chair, practically tripping over myself as I backed away from the window. My heart was hammering in my chest, and I could feel cold sweat dripping down my back. That thing, it was real, and it was outside my window. I grabbed my phone, fingers shaking as I dialed 911. My mind was racing, trying to come up with a way to explain this to the operator without sounding like a lunatic. But as I brought the phone to my ear, I heard something strange. Nothing. There was no dial tone, no sound at all, just silence. I looked down at my phone and my blood ran cold. The screen was completely black. I tried pressing the power button, tapping the screen. Nothing. It was like my phone had died the second I tried to call for help. Panic started to set in. I glanced back at the window, but the figure was gone. Just like that, vanished into thin air. I felt a sudden surge of adrenaline, my survival instincts kicking in. I ran to the front door, double-checking the locks, then rushed around the house, closing every curtain, every blind, making sure there was no way that thing could see inside. My mind was still spinning, trying to make sense of what was happening. Was I being watched, stalked? The thought of that man on the deep web came flooding back. He'd warned me. He'd told me, once I started, I wouldn't be able to stop. He wasn't talking about the conversation. He was talking about this. Whatever nightmare I had dragged into my life. I paced the living room, my heart racing, trying to figure out my next move. Should I leave? Drive somewhere? But then what? Where could I go that this thing couldn't follow? I didn't even know what it was. And somehow, that was the scariest part. Not knowing. After what felt like hours, the house had gone completely silent. It was eerie, like the air was heavy with something I couldn't explain. I kept expecting to hear that tapping again, or see that figure's face pressed against the glass. But the longer the silence stretched on, the more paranoid I became. I started jumping at every little creak of the house, every gust of wind against the windows. Eventually, I couldn't take it anymore. I had to do something. I had to know if it was still out there. Against my better judgment, I walked back over to the window, heart pounding in my throat. My hand hovered over the edge of the curtain, and I hesitated, not sure if I actually wanted to see what was outside, but I couldn't stop myself. I had to know. I slowly pulled the curtain back, just enough to peek through. There was nothing. No figure, no warped face, just the empty street, bathed in the dull orange glow of the streetlight. For a second, I let out a breath I didn't realize I was holding. Maybe it was gone. Maybe I was safe. But then, just as I was about to close the curtain, something caught my eye. Across the street, beneath the shadow of a tree, there was something on the ground. A book. It wasn't there before. I was sure of it. My stomach churned as I realized what it was. The book the man had shown me on the video feed. The same leather-bound, worn-out book with the strange symbols. I knew I shouldn't go out there. I knew it was probably a trap, but I couldn't shake the feeling that this book was important, that it held the answers I was desperately searching for. I grabbed my jacket, threw it on, and opened the front door, stepping outside into the cool night air. The street was eerily quiet. The only sound was the crunch of my shoes on the gravel as I walked toward the tree. The closer I got, the more my hands shook, but I couldn't stop now. I had to know. When I reached the book, I knelt down and picked it up, my fingers brushing against the worn leather cover. It felt cold, unnaturally cold, like it had been left in the snow for hours. I turned it over in my hands, but there was no title, no writing on the cover, just that strange, uneasy feeling that this was something I wasn't supposed to have. Before I could open it, I heard something behind me, a soft whisper. My name. I spun around, heart leaping into my throat. The street was empty, but I knew what I'd heard. Someone, something, had whispered my name. And then, before I could react, the lights in the street began to flicker. One by one, they went out, plunging the neighborhood into darkness. And in that darkness, I could feel it. Something was watching me. The street went completely black, and with it, everything around me seemed to close in. My breath caught in my throat, and for a moment, all I could hear was my own heartbeat thudding in my ears. The book was still clutched tightly in my hands, its cold surface almost burning against my skin. I was frozen, standing there in the middle of the street, knowing something was out there, watching, waiting. I took a step back, my foot crunching against the gravel, the only sound breaking the oppressive silence. I thought about running, but where would I go? My house? Would I really be safer there? Whatever this thing was, it had already shown it could find me, no matter where I hid. The darkness felt alive, like it was pressing down on me, suffocating me. I could feel eyes on me, multiple sets of eyes. I didn't know if it was paranoia or something worse, but it felt like the shadows themselves were moving, shifting, crawling toward me. And then there was a sound. Not a whisper this time. Not something I imagined. It was real, and it was close. A scraping sound, like metal dragging across the pavement. My blood turned cold, and I forced myself to look down the street. My eyes strained against the darkness, trying to make sense of what I was seeing, but the shadows seemed to ripple, like they were hiding something. Slowly, a figure began to emerge from the blackness. It was hunched over, its movements jerky and unnatural, like it was pulling itself forward with great effort. And in its hand, it dragged something, a long rusted chain, scraping against the ground with every step. I took another step back, my hands shaking so hard I thought I might drop the book. My mind was screaming at me to run, but my legs refused to cooperate. I couldn't tear my eyes away from the figure as it lurched closer, the chain clinking and scraping in an irregular rhythm, like it was dragging something heavy behind it. As it came into view, I could see it more clearly. The thing wasn't human, at least not anymore. Its skin was pale, almost translucent, stretched too tightly over its bones. Its mouth was twisted into a grotesque grin, far too wide, like someone had carved it into its face. And its eyes, those eyes were completely black, voids that seemed to absorb what little light remained in the air. But the worst part, the closer it got, the more I realized that it wasn't dragging the chain. It was dragging a body. The body looked broken, twisted in unnatural ways, its limbs bent at horrifying angles. I couldn't make out any details of the person. It was too dark, and the figure's movements were too jerky, but I could tell it had been dead for a while. That thing, whatever it was, had brought it here. I stumbled back, my heart racing out of control. I turned to run, but before I could take more than a few steps, I heard a voice behind me, low, guttural, and somehow impossibly familiar. "You shouldn't have looked." I froze. That voice, it wasn't coming from the thing dragging the body. It was coming from behind me. Slowly I turned around, the book still clutched tightly in my hands. Standing at the edge of the darkness, half hidden in the shadows, was the man from the video, the one who couldn't die. His expression was blank, his eyes cold and empty, but there was something different about him now. His face looked wrong, like it had been stretched, warped, just like the figure I'd seen earlier. It was like he was halfway between human and whatever that thing was. "You opened the book," he said, his voice low and flat. "You invited it in." I shook my head, trying to make sense of his words. What are you talking about?" "The book," he said, nodding toward the leather-bound tome in my hands. "It's not just a book. It's a key, a door, and now that you've touched it, you've let them in." I glanced down at the book, my heart sinking. I hadn't even opened it, hadn't even read a single page. How could it have done anything? "I didn't," I started to say, but he cut me off, stepping closer, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "You didn't have to. The moment you took it, the moment you laid your hands on it, you became part of it. And now they're coming for you." They. I looked past him, back toward the street, where the creature with the chain had been, but it was gone. The body, the scraping sound, all of it vanished. But somehow, that was worse. The silence, the oppressive darkness, it was all closing in, suffocating me. I felt like I couldn't breathe, like the shadows were wrapping themselves around me, tightening their grip. I stumbled backward, trying to put distance between me and the man, but no matter how far I moved, he seemed to follow, his feet never making a sound. "You should have left it alone," he said, his voice calm, almost pitying. "Now, it's too late. They're already here." I opened my mouth to scream, to shout, to do something, but before I could make a sound, the darkness around me exploded with movement. Shadows shifted, twisted, coalesced into shapes, inhuman shapes. The creatures that had been watching me, the things lurking just out of sight, they were no longer hiding. They were coming. I ran. I don't even remember deciding to run, but suddenly my feet were moving, my heart pounding in my chest as I sprinted toward my house. I could hear them behind me, the rustling of their movements, the guttural sounds of their breath. They were close, too close, but I didn't dare look back. I reached the front door, slamming it behind me, locking it as fast as I could. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely turn the lock, but I managed it, my back pressed against the door, trying to catch my breath. For a moment, there was silence. Then, the whispering started. I couldn't tell where it was coming from. It seemed to be all around me, inside the walls, under the floorboards, inside my own head. Dozens of voices, all speaking at once, too quiet to make out any words, but loud enough to drive me to the edge of panic. I clutched the book to my chest, backing away from the door, feeling the weight of it in my hands. It felt heavier now, like it was pulsing with some kind of energy. I didn't understand how or why, but I knew the book was the key to everything. It had brought this nightmare into my life, and it was the only thing that could end it. But I didn't know how. As I stood there, the whispers growing louder, I realized something. The man in the video had told me there was a price for immortality, and now I was beginning to understand what that price was. I had been given a choice, to leave, to walk away before it was too late, but I hadn't. I'd asked too many questions. I'd opened the door, and now I was trapped inside. Suddenly, the whispers stopped. The silence that followed was even worse, like the world was holding its breath, waiting for something terrible to happen. And then, from behind me, I heard it again, that soft, deliberate tapping on the window. The tapping at the window was slow and deliberate, like whoever, whatever, was out there knew exactly how terrified I was. Each tap echoed through the room, and with every sound, my heart seemed to beat harder, faster, like it was trying to escape my chest. My back was still pressed against the front door, and even though every instinct was screaming at me not to look, I couldn't help it. I turned my head, just slightly, just enough to catch a glimpse of the window. There was a shadow behind the glass, It was different from before. This time, it was closer, clearer. I could see the shape of a hand pressed against the window, fingers long and thin, stretching almost impossibly far. The figure behind the glass was tall, unnaturally so, its head bent down toward the window, its face hidden in the shadows. But I could feel it staring at me. The tapping continued. Slow, methodical. I squeezed the book tighter, my knuckles white from the pressure. It felt heavier than before, like it was trying to pull me down with it, to anchor me in place. The weight of it was unbearable, but I didn't dare let go. Deep down, I knew that as long as I held onto it, I was still in control, or at least as close to control as I could be in this nightmare. The tapping stopped. For a brief moment, there was silence. A silence so thick and heavy, it felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. I could feel the darkness around me, pressing in, suffocating. My breath came in shallow gasps, and my mind was racing, trying to figure out what to do next. Then, a voice came from the other side of the window. Software, almost a whisper, but unmistakably human. "Let me in." My blood ran cold. The voice wasn't monstrous or distorted like I'd expected. It was calm, familiar. It was my voice. I took a step back, my eyes wide, heart hammering in my chest. My own voice was calling to me, from the other side of the glass. That thing outside, whatever it was mimicking me, mocking me. My hand tightened around the book, desperate for answers, but I had none. The voice came again, more insistent this time. "Let me in." I stumbled back, nearly tripping over the edge of the coffee table. My mind was in overdrive, grasping for anything that made sense. But nothing did. The book, the man, the figures in the dark, it all felt like some twisted dream I couldn't wake up from. I had to do something, anything. I couldn't just stand there, waiting for that thing to come through the window. But what could I do? Every instinct told me to run, but where would I go? I was trapped. Then, I remembered something the man had said. The book is the key. It was more than just a warning. It was a clue. I opened the book with trembling hands, flipping through the old yellowed pages. Strange symbols and diagrams filled the pages, things I didn't recognize, couldn't even begin to understand. But as I skimmed through, something caught my eye. A single line of text, written in a language I couldn't read, but somehow I knew what it said. The only way to end it is to make the trade. The trade. What trade? The words felt heavy, like they carried more meaning than I could comprehend, but I couldn't think straight. I had to focus. The man had mentioned a price, and now I was beginning to understand. The book wasn't just cursed, it was binding me to something, a contract, and that contract had a cost. I looked at the window again. The figure was still there, pressed up against the glass, its long fingers tapping ever so gently, waiting for me to make a decision. Suddenly, the man's voice rang in my head, clear as day. "Once you open the door, you can't go back." He wasn't just talking about a metaphorical door. He meant it literally. The door I had opened when I took the book. That's when I realized I could go back, but only if I gave the book what it wanted. A trade. I didn't know what I was trading, but I knew I didn't have a choice. Either I gave the book what it demanded, or I let that thing outside in. The thought of it, of whatever was mimicking my voice, twisting it, bending reality to torment me, made my stomach turn. I didn't want to know what would happen if I let it inside. With no other options, I took a deep breath and set the book down on the floor in front of me. The moment I did, I felt a shift in the air, like the room itself had exhaled. The whispers returned, louder now, almost deafening, filling my head with chaotic noise. I knelt beside the book, flipping to the page with the strange symbols and diagrams. I didn't know what to do, but somehow my hands moved on their own, tracing the symbols with my fingers, drawing shapes in the air. As I did, the whispers grew more frantic, more urgent, and the tapping at the window became louder, faster, more insistent. I could hear the voice outside growing desperate, repeating over and over, "Let me in, let me in." But I ignored it, focusing on the symbols, the words I didn't understand but somehow knew. My fingers moved faster, and the room seemed to vibrate with energy, like something was building, something ancient, something terrible. And then, with a final motion, I slammed my hand down on the page. Everything stopped. The tapping, the whispering, the voice at the window. Silence descended on the room, so complete and sudden it felt like the world had been sucked into a vacuum. I stayed there, kneeling by the book, my breath ragged, waiting for something to happen. Slowly, I lifted my head and looked at the window. The figure was gone. The street outside was still dark, but the oppressive feeling, the sense of being watched, it had vanished. I cautiously got to my feet, my body trembling with exhaustion, and walked over to the window. I peered outside, but there was nothing, just the empty street, silent and still. I didn't feel relieved. I didn't feel safe. There was something wrong about the silence, something that made my skin crawl. I turned back to the book, still open on the floor. The page with the symbols had changed. The writing had disappeared, replaced by a blank, empty sheet. And in the center of the page, where my hand had touched, there was a single line of text. "The trade has been made." I stared at the words, my mind reeling. What trade? What had I given up? And then I heard it, a soft tapping, not from the window, but from behind me. I turned around, slowly, my blood turning to ice in my veins. Standing in the corner of the room, half hidden in the shadows, was a figure. Pale, gaunt, with eyes as black as the void, its mouth stretched into a wide, grotesque smile, too wide for any human face. It was me, or at least it looked like me. The same features, the same clothes, but twisted, wrong, just like the thing that had been outside. And then it spoke, in my voice. "The trade has been made." It stepped forward, and I realized what I had traded. I had traded myself. The thing grinned wider, its eyes gleaming in the dark, as it took another step toward me. I stumbled back, but there was nowhere to go, nowhere to run. I had opened the door, and now I was on the outside. I bought a dog of the deep web to assist my deaf girlfriend. The dog keeps alerting her to sounds that are not there. All right, so let me set the stage for this. My girlfriend Katie has been deaf since she was born. She's amazing. Seriously. She reads lips like it's second nature and has the sharpest intuition of anyone I know. We've been together for about 2 years now, and despite the challenges her condition brings, we've always found ways to make it work. We've got a system, you know? Lights flicker when the doorbell rings, our phones vibrate with notifications, and we've developed a pretty unique way of communicating, but it's seamless for us. A few months ago, Katie started talking about getting a service dog. Specifically, she wanted one that could assist her with sounds, like a hearing dog. I didn't know much about it at the time, but apparently, dogs can be trained to alert deaf people to important sounds, like alarms or knocks on the door. It sounded like a good idea, but as you probably know, trained service dogs cost a fortune. And to be blunt, we didn't have the kind of cash lying around to drop on one. That's when I made the mistake. You see, I've always been a bit curious about the deep web. I'd never really done much on it, but I'd read enough stories to be intrigued. And that's when it hit me. If people sell everything on the deep web, maybe I could find a service dog there for a fraction of the cost. At first, Katie thought it was a joke. But after a few nights of me poking around, I found this obscure site selling all kinds of animals. Some of them were unsettling, to say the least. But amidst the madness, there was a listing for trained dogs, specifically for people with disabilities. The price was stupid cheap. Red flag, right? But in my head, I just figured these were breeders who didn't want to go through the hassle of licensing and all that. I thought, how bad could it be? I should have known better. I clicked the buy button, and after a weirdly short exchange with the seller, the dog was scheduled to arrive within a week. The seller assured me that the dog was well trained, obedient, and specialized in alerting deaf individuals to sounds like alarms, doorbells, and phone rings. The whole process was anonymous, and while it felt a little shady, everything seemed on track. A few days later, this large mixed breed dog showed up at our door. He looked pretty normal, maybe a little scruffy, but nothing alarming. Katie loved him right away. She named him Milo, and he was instantly attached to her. The dog seemed to know what to do from the start. He'd nudge her when the doorbell rang, put a paw on her leg if something buzzed in the apartment, and even alerted her when the microwave beeped. It was like magic at first. But then, things started getting weird. About a week after Milo arrived, Katie began telling me that he was alerting her to sounds that weren't happening. She signed to me that Milo had nudged her in the middle of the night, as if the doorbell had rung or a phone had gone off. But I'd check, and there was nothing. At first, I brushed it off. I figured maybe he was adjusting to his new environment, or maybe he was over-eager to do his job. But it kept happening. At random times during the day, Milo would go into alert mode, pointing Katie towards nothing. No alarms, no knocks, just eerie silence. I'd be sitting across from her, watching it all unfold, feeling this heavy pit form in my stomach. Katie was confused, but didn't seem too freaked out at first. Then last night happened. It was around 2 a.m. I was asleep, but I felt Katie shaking me awake. I opened my eyes to see her signing frantically, pointing towards the bedroom door. Milo had woken her up, barking softly, his body tense. Katie told me that Milo had been alerting her to something outside the apartment for over an hour. I was exhausted and annoyed. I got up, threw on some sweatpants, and walked to the door, half expecting to see some raccoon or stray cat outside. But when I looked through the peephole, there was nothing. No one, not even a car on the street. The whole block was dead quiet. I turned to Milo, who was standing by the door, growling low in his throat. That was the first time I'd ever heard him growl. His hackles were raised, and he looked ready to pounce on whatever he thought was out there. That's when I started feeling like maybe I'd made a huge mistake. Maybe buying a dog from the deep web wasn't the smartest idea after all. But still, I rationalized it. Maybe Milo was just being overprotective. Maybe there was some animal outside that I couldn't see, and he was picking up on it. But that doesn't explain what happened this morning. Katie and I were having breakfast when Milo suddenly jumped up, ran to the window, and started barking like crazy. Katie looked at me, wide-eyed, signing that something was wrong. I walked over to the window and looked outside. There was nothing there. No people, no cars, just an empty street. But Milo, he wasn't barking at the street. He was barking at the air. Now I can't shake the feeling that whatever Milo's hearing, whatever he's alerting Katie to, it's not something we can see or understand, and it's getting worse. It didn't take long before things escalated, and it started to feel like the walls were closing in. I didn't want to admit it at first. I mean, how do you explain something you can't even see or hear? After that morning, with Milo barking at nothing, Katie became visibly uneasy. She didn't need to say it. I could see it in her face. She would try to calm him down, signing softly to him like she did when he got too excited. But Milo wouldn't back down. He was glued to the window, eyes wide, as if he was seeing something we couldn't. Every time I tried to pull him away, he resisted, growling low, like he was warning us of some invisible intruder. By now, the strange behavior wasn't just a rare occurrence. It was happening every day. Milo would pace the apartment, randomly jerking his head toward corners of the room, alerting Katie like there was something urgent we couldn't hear. What really sent chills through me, though, was how he kept leading her to the same spot, the hallway closet. At first, I thought maybe there was something behind the wall, like a pipe making noise or something. I mean, there had to be a rational explanation, right? But every time Milo dragged her to the closet, I checked, and there was nothing. No sounds, no animals, no faulty pipes. Just silence. The breaking point came one evening when I got home from work. Katie was sitting on the couch, pale as a sheet, her phone clutched in her hand. Milo was lying at her feet, staring directly at the hallway. His body was rigid, like he was waiting for something to happen. I signed to her, asking what was wrong. She responded with trembling hands. The dog has been alerting me all day. I heard knocking, but when I checked the door, no one was there. He won't stop. I walked over to the door, more out of frustration than anything. But as I reached for the knob, Milo leapt up and bit my pen leg, pulling me back. This wasn't like him. He was always gentle, obedient, but this was pure desperation. I knelt down and held his face in my hands, trying to calm him down. His eyes darted between me and the door, like he was silently begging me not to open it. I didn't. Instead, I stayed up that night. Katie had gone to bed early, exhausted from Milo's relentless alerting, but I couldn't sleep. I sat on the couch, staring at the hallway, listening for something, anything that would explain what was going on. That's when I heard it. A faint knock, not on the door, but from somewhere inside the apartment. I froze, my heart doing that thing where it feels like it skips a beat. I leaned forward, straining to hear again, thinking maybe I was just tired. Maybe my mind was playing tricks on me. But then it happened again. Tap, tap, tap. Soft, deliberate, like someone was knocking from the inside of the closet. Milo shot up from his spot on the floor, growling low in his throat. His entire body was tense as he slowly backed away, his eyes locked on the hallway closet door. I couldn't move for a moment. My mind was racing, searching for an explanation. Maybe there was something behind the wall after all. Maybe a rat had gotten in, or the neighbors were making noise. But the knocking didn't stop. It was rhythmic, almost patient. I stood up, cautiously making my way to the closet. Milo didn't follow. He just sat there, watching me, with wide eyes, his ears pinned back. As I reached for the closet door, the air around me felt heavier, like something was pressing down on my chest. I yanked the door open. Nothing. There was nothing inside but coats and shoes. The closet was small, cramped, and definitely empty. I sighed, half relieved, but mostly just annoyed with myself. I was letting this situation get to me more than I wanted to admit. But then, as I turned to close the door, something caught my eye. On the inside of the closet door, right at eye level, were 3 small scratches. They looked fresh, as if someone or something had been clawing at it from the inside. I didn't tell Katie about the scratches. I didn't want to freak her out more than she already was. I convinced myself that maybe it was just an old mark I hadn't noticed before. I mean, what else could it be? But that night, Milo wouldn't settle. He kept circling the apartment, his nose pressed to the ground, as if he were tracking something unseen. At one point, he stopped at the foot of our bed, staring into the dark hallway, and let out a low, guttural growl that sent chills through my entire body. Katie was asleep, oblivious to it all. But I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone in the apartment anymore. Something had shifted. Milo wasn't just alerting us to noises. He was warning us. As I lay there in the dark, listening to the eerie silence of the apartment, I couldn't help but wonder what exactly I had let into our lives by bringing Milo here. Because whatever it wasn't leaving. After that night, things started to spiral fast. It wasn't just the knocking anymore. Now there were moments when the entire apartment felt wrong, like the air was heavier, charged with something I couldn't see. Even Katie, who's always so grounded, started acting differently. She wasn't saying much, but I could tell. There was this uneasy look in her eyes, like she was constantly waiting for something to happen. Milo wasn't the same either. He went from being alert to practically neurotic. He would sit at the closet for hours, staring at it like it held some kind of horrible secret. And the scratches, they kept getting worse. Every time I checked, there were more of them, deeper now, jagged like whatever was doing. It was growing more frantic. I even locked the closet door one night, just to see if that would stop whatever was inside. The next morning, the door was wide open, the scratches even more pronounced. Katie didn't know about the scratches, or at least I hadn't told her. She had enough to deal with, and I figured the last thing she needed was more stress. But the way she would look at Milo, then back at the closet, told me she knew something wasn't right. A few days ago, something happened that shook me to my core. I was in the kitchen, making dinner, while Katie was in the living room. Milo had been strangely calm all day, which almost worried me more than his usual frantic behavior. Katie was watching TV, completely zoned out. I glanced over and noticed Milo sitting at her feet, staring straight ahead at the hallway. His head tilted slightly, ears perked, like he was listening to something. But it was his tail that caught my attention. It wasn't wagging. It was stiff, tense. That's when I heard it again. The knocking. 3 slow, deliberate taps. Not from the closet this time, but from somewhere closer. It sounded like it came from inside the apartment, like someone was knocking on the wall from within the very foundation. Milo shut up, and this time, he didn't just growl. He barked, loud, frantic, like he was warning us about something right next to us. Katie jumped, startled by the sudden noise, and turned to me with wide eyes. Her hands were moving fast as she signed. "What's happening? Is someone outside?" I tried to play it off, telling her it was probably just the building settling, but my voice was shaky. She didn't buy it. Neither did Milo. His barking grew more intense, more desperate, and I couldn't ignore it anymore. I grabbed a flashlight and headed toward the hallway, trying to figure out where the noise was coming from. Milo followed closely behind me, his bark now just a low rumble deep in his throat. The closer I got to the hallway, the more I could feel that strange pressure in the air again. It was suffocating, like I was walking through water. When I reached the closet, I hesitated for a moment. Every part of me wanted to turn around, go back to the living room, and pretend none of this was happening. But something was pulling me forward, something beyond curiosity. I had to know. I slowly opened the closet door, half expecting to see more scratches, or worse. But what I found was so much worse than I could have imagined. The floor of the closet was wet, not like water had leaked in, but like something damp had moved through it. There were muddy smears leading from the far corner of the closet to the doorway, like someone or something had crawled out. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. Milo was losing it, barking wildly now. But there was something else, a sound I hadn't heard before, a soft, whispering noise, like a faint murmur, just barely audible over Milo's barking. I strained to hear it, but it was so low, almost like it was inside my head rather than the apartment. And then, just as quickly as it started, the whispering stopped. Everything went silent. I backed away from the closet, slamming the door shut with more force than I intended. My hands were shaking, and Milo was still pacing, whining now instead of barking, like even he didn't know what to do anymore. I didn't tell Katie about the wet floor or the whispering. I didn't even know how to explain it to myself, let alone her. But that night, I couldn't sleep. Every creak of the apartment, every gust of wind against the windows, it all felt wrong, like something was watching, waiting. Katie, for her part, seemed more distant than usual. She hadn't talked about Milo's behavior as much, but I could tell she was still bothered by it. She started sleeping with the lights on, something she hadn't done since we moved in together. And Milo, he wouldn't even come into the bedroom anymore. He just stayed in the hallway, guarding the closet as if whatever had come out of it was still lurking nearby. The next morning, things got worse. I was in the bathroom, brushing my teeth, when I noticed something strange in the mirror. At first, I thought it was a smudge, a streak of condensation from the steam. But as I wiped it away, I saw it. 3 long scratches etched into the surface of the mirror. The same 3 lines, just like the ones on the closet door. I felt my stomach drop. This wasn't just some animal. This wasn't something we could ignore anymore. I knew that whatever I had brought into our home wasn't normal. And worse, I had no idea how to get rid of it. I don't know how I convinced myself things would get better on their own. Maybe I thought if we just ignored it, whatever was happening would stop. But it didn't. It only got worse. That night, Katie and I were both on edge. I didn't mention the scratches on the bathroom mirror to her. I didn't want to freak her out more than she already was. She hadn't signed much to me all day, and when she did, it was short, quick bursts, like she was trying to communicate, but didn't really want to say what was on her mind. I could tell she wasn't sleeping well either. Dark circles had started to form under her eyes, and she seemed to jump at every little thing. Milo, as usual, refused to leave his spot in the hallway. He hadn't slept properly in days either. His eyes were bloodshot, his fur matted, and his growling had become a near-constant background noise. It was unnerving. The way he fixated on the closet, like something was just waiting inside, sent chills down my spine every time I walked past it. That evening, as we sat on the couch, I caught Katie looking at me out of the corner of her eye. She sighed slowly. I don't think it's safe here anymore. I didn't know how to respond. I knew she was right. Hell, I'd been thinking the same thing for days. But there was something about the way she said it. Like she wasn't just talking about the apartment. She was talking about something else entirely. Something we couldn't escape from, no matter where we went. I nodded, trying to reassure her. But deep down, I didn't feel reassured myself. Later that night, just as we were getting ready for bed, I heard the noise again. This time, it wasn't a knock. It was more of a dragging sound, like something heavy was being pulled across the floor. Katie couldn't hear it, of course, but Milo perked up immediately. He ran toward the hallway, barking and scratching at the closet door like he was trying to get in. I stood there, frozen for a moment, before snapping out of it and rushing after him. I yanked the closet door open. Nothing. The same nothing that had greeted me every time. But the noise, the dragging sound, it hadn't stopped. It was louder now, echoing through the apartment, coming from behind the walls. Katie was standing behind me, her face pale, signing frantically. What is it? What's wrong? I didn't know how to explain it. There was something moving behind the walls, something we couldn't see, but could definitely hear. The dragging continued, slow and deliberate, like it was getting closer. I grabbed Katie's hand, pulling her toward the bedroom. I wasn't going to wait around to see what it was. We locked ourselves in the bedroom. Milo stood at the door, barking like his life depended on it. Katie kept looking at me, fear evident in her eyes, asking if I'd heard it too. I nodded, trying to stay calm, but the truth was, I was terrified. I didn't know what to do. I didn't know what this thing was or how to stop it. Just as I was about to suggest we leave the apartment, the dragging sound stopped. The silence that followed was suffocating. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest as I pressed my ear against the door, listening for any sign of movement. Nothing. Then Katie tapped me on the shoulder, her face pale. She pointed toward the bedroom window, her hand shaking. I turned slowly, and that's when I saw it. 3 long, jagged scratches had appeared on the glass. The same scratches. I stared at them, unable to process what I was seeing. How could they have gotten there? We were on the 2nd floor, and there was no balcony, no way for anyone, or anything, to reach that window. Katie was trembling now, signing with shaky hands. We need to leave. Now. I didn't argue. I grabbed my keys, my wallet, and a jacket for Katie, and we rushed out of the apartment. Milo followed close behind, his barking relentless, like he was trying to warn us that something was still coming. We didn't stop until we reached the car. The air outside felt different, lighter, almost. For the first time in days, I felt like I could breathe again, but I knew we couldn't stay in the car forever. We needed answers. We needed to figure out what the hell was happening to us. As we sat in the car, I decided to pull up the deep web forum where I'd found Milo. Maybe I could contact the seller, find out if there was something they hadn't told me. It was a long shot, but at this point, I was desperate. But when I tried to access the site, it was gone. The page wouldn't load. No matter what I tried, the forum had disappeared, wiped clean like it had never existed. My stomach sank. There was no trace of the seller, no contact information, nothing. It was like Milo had come out of nowhere, dropped into our lives from some void, and now We were stuck with whatever came with him. Katie was sitting in the passenger seat, staring blankly ahead. She signed to me. What do we do now? I didn't have an answer for her. I couldn't even begin to figure out how to fix this. But I knew one thing. Something was in that apartment. Something I had unknowingly invited in. And wherever we went next, I had a feeling it would follow. I don't know why I thought leaving the apartment would change anything. Maybe I just hoped that putting some distance between us and that place would keep us safe. But deep down, I knew better. Whatever I had brought into our lives wasn't tied to the apartment. It was tied to us, and it wasn't letting go. We spent that night in a cheap motel on the outskirts of town, the kind of place that smells like stale cigarettes and bleach, but it felt like a sanctuary compared to what we'd been dealing with. Katie was exhausted, barely able to keep her eyes open, but Milo wouldn't rest. He paced the room, nose to the ground, his body tense, like he was expecting something to burst through the walls at any moment. I sat on the edge of the bed, my mind racing. I had no idea what to do next. Every attempt to trace back to where I had bought Milo was a dead end. The forum was gone, erased from the web like it had never existed. I'd even tried searching for the seller's username, but it brought up nothing. No records, no posts. Just nothing. Katie was sitting on the bed next to me, her face pale and drawn. She signed to me. Do you think it's over? I didn't know how to answer her. I didn't want to lie, but I also didn't want to scare her any more than she already was. So I just shrugged, hoping it would be enough to calm her nerves, at least for a little while. That's when Milo started barking again. This time, it was different. His bark wasn't just a warning, it was frantic, panicked. He lunged at the door to the motel room, scratching at it with a ferocity I hadn't seen before. Katie jumped up from the bed, her eyes wide with fear, signing to me. What's happening? I grabbed Milo's collar, trying to pull him back, but he was too strong. His growling intensified, and for the first time, I felt like he wasn't trying to protect us from something outside. He was trying to keep something in. I stepped back, dragging Milo with me, and that's when I heard it. The same dragging sound, the one we'd heard in the apartment, now coming from the hallway outside the motel room. Slow, deliberate, like something was being pulled toward us, scraping along the floor. Katie couldn't hear it, but she could see the fear in my face. She grabbed my arm, signing frantically. Is it here? I nodded, feeling my stomach twist into knots. I didn't want to open the door. I didn't want to know what was out there. But at the same time, I knew we couldn't just sit here, waiting for it to come to us. I took a deep breath and slowly opened the door. The hallway was empty. No people, no signs of anything out of the ordinary. But the air was thick with that same heavy pressure, like something was watching us. And then I saw it. There, at the far end of the hallway, was a figure. It was barely visible in the dim light, but it was there, hunched over, dragging itself along the floor. I couldn't make out its face, just the slow, agonizing way it moved, like it was pulling itself toward us inch by inch. I slammed the door shut, my heart racing. Milo was barking wildly now, pacing in circles, and Katie was staring at me, terrified. We need to leave, I said, my voice shaking. We can't stay here. Katie didn't argue. She grabbed her jacket, and we ran. We didn't bother checking out or grabbing any of our things. We just sprinted to the car, Milo bounding behind us, and peeled out of the parking lot like the place was on fire. For hours, we drove in silence. The roads were empty, and the sun was starting to rise. But even as the light crept over the horizon, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being followed. Every shadow on the road seemed darker. Every sound from the outside world felt sharper, more menacing. Katie sat next to me, her hands trembling as she signed. "Where are we going?" I had no idea. I just kept driving, hoping that somehow, if we put enough miles between us and the motel, we could outrun whatever was after us. But deep down, I knew that wasn't going to work. Milo started growling again. This time, he wasn't looking at the road or the surrounding landscape. He was looking at me. I glanced at him in the rearview mirror, and for a second, I thought I saw something in his eyes. Something unfamiliar. Something wrong. His growling grew louder, more aggressive, and I felt a chill run down my spine. Katie grabbed my arm, her eyes wide. "What's wrong with him?" she signed. I didn't know. Milo had been acting strange ever since we got him, but this was different. He wasn't just alerting us to something outside. He was turning on us. I pulled over to the side of the road, my hands shaking as I unbuckled my seatbelt. Milo's growling grew louder, and he started snapping at the air, his teeth bared like he was ready to attack. I opened the car door, trying to calm him down, but he lunged at me, teeth gnashing just inches from my face. Katie screamed, signing frantically. "Get him out of the car!" I grabbed Milo by the collar, struggling to pull him out of the back seat. His body was thrashing wildly, and for a moment, I thought he was going to tear me apart. But then, just as quickly as it started, it stopped. Milo collapsed on the side of the road, his body twitching, foam gathering at the corners of his mouth. I stared down at him, my heart pounding, as Katie stood behind me, her face pale. We waited. Minutes passed, and Milo didn't move. He just lay there, lifeless. Katie signed. "Is he dead?" I knelt down beside him, checking for any sign of breath. Nothing. And that's when I saw it. The scratches. 3 long, jagged marks running down Milo's side, identical to the ones on the closet door, the mirror, and the window. My blood ran cold. I realized then that it hadn't been Milo alerting us to something. He had been part of whatever was happening all along. I had brought it into our lives. And now it was waiting for something else. I turned to Katie, my hand shaking as I signed. "We're not safe." And in the distance, just barely audible over the sound of the wind, I heard it again. The dragging. Closer now. It was coming for us. The end. I was hired on the dark web to map alien territories on Earth. The maps are moving. So, I'm not exactly the kind of person who usually messes around on the dark web. Sure, I've heard all the horror stories. People stumbling onto creepy forums, or worse, getting involved in things they shouldn't. I always thought that stuff was for reckless idiots, the type of people who crave chaos in their lives. But sometimes, life throws you curveballs, and suddenly, what seems like a terrible idea becomes the only option left. That's how I ended up doing something really stupid. Let me back up a bit. I'd been out of a job for a few months. Not just any job, though. I was a cartographer. Yeah, maps and stuff. It's not the most glamorous job, but I loved it. There's something satisfying about taking an abstract idea, like the shape of a country or a city, and turning it into something tangible. But cartography isn't exactly a booming field these days, and after my company downsized, I was screwed. My bills were piling up, my savings were gone, and I was desperate. That's when I remembered hearing about a friend of a friend, a guy who supposedly found work through the dark web. I don't know if I was more skeptical or desperate at that point, but one late night, I thought, screw it, let's see what I can find. At first, it was exactly what you'd expect. Sketchy drug markets, shady forums with people selling stolen credit cards, the usual nightmare fuel. I was about to log off and abandon the whole idea when I found a weirdly specific job board. Nothing illegal, or at least nothing obviously illegal, but really odd. There was one job posting that caught my eye. It was titled, Urgent Skilled Cartographer, Needed for Unusual Mapping Project. High pay, remote work. The pay listed was insane, way more than any legit job I could hope to land. The description was vague though, something about mapping territories that don't exist on conventional maps. The words felt wrong, but like I said, I was desperate. I clicked through, expecting some prank or scam, but what I found was worse. It was real. The post asked for a quick application process, and it said, if you had experience in cartography and access to your own mapping software, you could start immediately. It had this list of requirements: discreet, comfortable working alone, able to map territories not visible by conventional satellite systems. I should have stopped there. Territories not visible by satellite. Come on. But the money, man, it was more than enough to dig myself out of the hole I was in, and it wasn't like I had any better options, so I applied. I sent a few examples of my past work, fully expecting to never hear back, or at worst, get my identity stolen. But the next morning, I woke up to an email. It wasn't the generic confirmation I was expecting. Instead, it was a simple message, something that chilled me, even though I didn't understand why. Welcome aboard. Expect further instructions soon. 2 days later, I got another email. This one had an attachment and a short message. Begin here. The attachment was a series of map files, basic outlines, but they looked like nothing I'd ever seen. They weren't countries or cities, and they didn't match any natural formations on Earth. The files were labeled in a weird sequence of letters and numbers that meant nothing to me. There were no coordinates, no names, just these bizarre shapes. And the strangest part? They were all laid out as if they represented territory, but the territories were shifting ever so slightly, like they were alive, breathing. Now, I know what you're thinking. This is where I should have bailed, right? I mean, what kind of job has you mapping places that don't even exist, with no context? But curiosity got the better of me, and like I said, I needed the money. The instructions in the email were simple, but odd. It told me to overlay the maps onto real locations on Earth, but not by standard satellite images. Instead, I was supposed to use some obscure program I'd never heard of, called TerraVision. It was like Google Earth, but glitchier, way glitchier. The maps, when applied to different areas of Earth, did something I can't explain. The territories aligned, like they'd snap into place over certain parts of the world, but only if you zoomed in to a specific scale. One of the first places I mapped was the middle of the Pacific Ocean, a place where nothing should have been. But when I laid the alien map over it, something appeared. An island that shouldn't exist. No coordinates, no names, just a shape that suddenly existed where there was once empty water. And I wasn't just seeing this through the program. When I cross-referenced satellite data, that area was blank, but the TerraVision map insisted there was something there. I kept mapping, placing these territories across different parts of the world. Deserts, forests, even populated areas, and with each new map, the territories got weirder. The boundaries didn't follow any logical patterns, and the shapes started to move more noticeably. At first, it was subtle, but after hours of staring at them, I realized that the maps weren't static. They were shifting, expanding, almost like they were breathing, growing. I emailed the job contact, asking for clarification, but all I got back was a terse reply. Do not contact us again unless there is an emergency. That was my first real red flag, but I convinced myself to keep going. After all, maybe it was just some new experimental tech, and I didn't want to lose the job. But deep down, something didn't sit right. The maps weren't just strange, they felt wrong, unnatural. Part 3. Strange observations. That's when the physical weirdness started. A week into the project, things in my apartment began to change. It started with small stuff. At first, it was like I was just misplacing things. My keys weren't where I left them. The TV remote was always in the wrong spot. I figured it was just stress. But then I began noticing something else. The air felt heavier, like the atmosphere in my apartment was different. It was subtle, but when I was working on those maps, the room would feel stifling, like I wasn't alone. I'd look over my shoulder and swear I saw something move in the corner of my eye. Just a flicker of a shadow, or the faintest noise. At first, I blamed sleep deprivation, maybe paranoia from being stuck in my apartment for so long. But then, it got worse. One night, I was working late, mapping a particularly large territory that spanned a part of Siberia. As I clicked through TerraVision, my screen suddenly flickered. For a second, I thought my computer had frozen, but then I noticed something strange. In the reflection of my screen, just behind me, I could see the shape of a person. Not a distinct person, but an outline, blurry, like someone standing in the room with me, only visible through the reflection on the monitor. I whipped around, but no one was there. My heart was racing. I stared at the screen for what felt like forever, but nothing happened. The figure was gone. I was about to chalk it up to stress when my computer dinged with a new email. It was from my mysterious employer. You are making good progress. Keep going. I sat there staring at the email, my body frozen in place. We are coming soon. Don't resist. The words felt heavy, like they had physical weight, pressing down on my chest. I wanted to shut the computer, delete the email, and throw my laptop out the window, but I couldn't. My hand hovered over the keyboard, paralyzed by fear and some strange compulsion. A part of me wanted to see what would happen next, even though every instinct screamed at me to stop. The room felt darker, colder, and I noticed the air had that same metallic tang from before, like blood in my mouth. I couldn't explain it, but it was back, stronger than ever. The world outside my apartment seemed distant, muffled, like I was underwater. I forced myself to take a deep breath, trying to clear my head. I knew something was coming, something worse than shadowy figures at my door or shifting maps on a screen. I could feel it, but I had no idea how close it really was. That night, I couldn't sleep. I don't think I even tried. I just sat in my living room, staring at the door, waiting for whatever was supposed to happen. I checked the windows periodically, but there were no figures standing outside this time. No one watching. In a weird way, that made it worse. It felt like the calm before the storm. Around 3 a.m., something changed. It started with a low hum, barely audible at first, like a distant engine or an electrical current running through the walls. I thought it was my mind playing tricks on me, but the sound grew louder, vibrating the air around me. It wasn't coming from outside. It was inside my apartment, right above me. I looked up, and for a moment, I swear I saw the ceiling ripple, like the surface of a pond disturbed by a stone. I blinked, my breath catching in my throat, and the ripple was gone. But the hum continued. It grew louder and louder until the walls began to shake, the pictures on my wall vibrating in their frames. My ears started ringing, the pressure building in my head like my skull was about to split open. And then, just as quickly as it had started, it stopped. Everything went silent. For a few moments, I just sat there, not daring to move, my pulse thudding in my ears. I glanced at my laptop, still open on the table. The map on the screen had changed again. The territories were no longer shifting. They were completely still. All the moving parts had frozen in place, forming a perfect, intricate web. And at the center of that web, marked in glowing red, was my apartment. That's when I heard the door creak. I turned slowly, my body tensing as the door to my apartment, the locked door, swung open on its own. No one was standing there. Nothing was pushing it. It just opened, like it was inviting something inside. My heart pounded so hard, I could barely hear anything over the rush of blood in my ears. And then they stepped inside. The figures I'd seen outside before, the ones that had watched me from the street, were now inside my home. But they weren't just shadows anymore. Up close, they were worse. Much worse. They were tall, unnaturally so, with long, gaunt limbs that seemed to stretch and bend at odd angles. Their faces were obscured, like they were blurred out of focus, shifting and morphing as they moved. It was like trying to look at something in a dream, where nothing quite makes sense. They didn't speak. They didn't have to. I knew what they wanted. They were here for me. I stumbled backward, my legs weak, my mind screaming at me to run, but there was nowhere to go. They moved toward me, gliding across the floor, their steps silent. I backed up until I hit the wall, my chest heaving, my eyes darting around the room for any kind of escape. But it was pointless. They reached out, their long skeletal fingers brushing against my arm, and that's when I felt it. The cold. It wasn't just a chill. It was a deep, penetrating cold that sank into my bones. My skin burned where they touched me, like ice freezing over the nerves. I tried to scream, but nothing came out. As they closed in around me, I noticed something on the screen. My laptop was flickering again, and the map had changed once more. The web of territories was collapsing in on itself, shrinking, compressing into one singular point. And that point was me. Suddenly, I was hit with a wave of nausea. My vision blurred, the room spinning as I collapsed to my knees. The hum returned, louder than before, vibrating through my entire body. The figures leaned over me, their faces still shifting, and I could feel them drawing closer, like they were pulling me into their cold, distorted presence. I don't know how to explain what happened next. It wasn't like I blacked out. It was worse. It was like reality itself folded in on me, like my body was being sucked into the map, into that point where the territories converged. The world around me warped, bending and twisting, and I felt myself being pulled apart, pulled through the map. I woke up somewhere else. I don't know how long I was out. It felt like both seconds and hours at the same time, if that even makes sense. When I opened my eyes, I wasn't in my apartment anymore. I was outside, lying on cold, damp ground. The air was thick with fog, the kind that clings to your skin and leaves you feeling wet and heavy. It took me a second to get my bearings, but when I looked around, I realized something horrifying. The place I had mapped, it wasn't just some abstract territory. It was real. I was inside it. The land around me stretched out in impossible ways, with jagged mountains that looked like they'd been torn straight from the earth, and rivers that flowed upward, defying gravity. The sky above was dark, not with clouds, but with something else, something I can't describe. It wasn't stars or planets. It was more like shapes, vast and shifting, moving slowly above me. And the worst part, I wasn't alone. In the distance, I saw them, those same figures, hundreds of them, moving across the landscape in a slow, deliberate march. They didn't seem to notice me, or maybe they didn't care. They were heading somewhere, and deep down, I knew where they were going. I stood up, my legs trembling, and looked around. This wasn't a place I could run from. This was where the maps had led me. It wasn't just an alien territory. It was something older, something that had been hidden for centuries, something I had unlocked by mapping those shifting territories. I was part of it now. As I tried to gather my thoughts, I heard something behind me, a low rumbling sound, like a deep breath being drawn from the very earth itself. I turned, and there, rising from the ground, was something massive, something alive. It was the land itself. It had woken up. The territory wasn't just a map. It was a living, breathing entity, and I had been drawn into its core. I was too late to run, too late to do anything but stare as the ground beneath me shifted, pulling me into its depths. The last thing I saw before everything went dark was the figures closing in, their faces still shifting, their movements slow and deliberate. I knew then that I wasn't mapping alien territories. I was mapping the boundaries of a world that was never meant to be seen. I don't know how long I was trapped in that darkness. Minutes, hours, days. Time didn't exist in that place, not in the way I understood it. I wasn't dead, but I wasn't really alive either. I could feel myself being pulled deeper into the ground, into the core of this thing, the territory I'd mapped. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. My body wasn't mine anymore. I was weightless, drifting through layers of black, thick as oil, sinking further into a place I couldn't comprehend. The cold was unbearable, like nothing I'd ever felt before. It wasn't the kind of cold that makes you shiver. It was something more primal, something that felt like it was freezing my thoughts, my very existence. Then all at once, I stopped. The darkness around me cracked, like a shell breaking apart, and I found myself standing or floating on a vast, flat surface. The air here was strange, dense, and electric. I could feel it humming around me. There were no landmarks, no horizon, just an endless expanse of black glass, perfectly smooth and cold beneath my feet. But what really unsettled me was the sky. There was no sun, no moon, only the same shifting shapes I'd seen before, swirling above like storm clouds, except they weren't clouds. They were massive things. They had no form, no features, just a presence that radiated something I can only describe as awareness. They knew I was there. I looked around, desperate to find some clue, some way out of this nightmare. That's when I saw it, a figure standing in the distance. Not one of the faceless things that had stalked me before. This figure was different, human, or at least it looked that way. Tall, slender, dressed in a long dark coat with a hood pulled low over its face. It stood motionless, watching me from across the endless expanse. I took a step towards it, my body trembling with a mix of fear and hope. Maybe this was someone who could help me, someone who could explain what the hell was happening. But as I approached, I felt a familiar sensation, a pressure like the one I'd felt in my apartment. The air around me thickened, and that metallic taste filled my mouth again. I stopped, my heart pounding in my chest. I was close enough now to see its face, or rather, the lack of one. Beneath the hood, there was nothing, just smooth, empty skin where a face should have been. It didn't move, didn't speak, but I felt it watching me, studying me. The hum in the air grew louder, more intense, like it was vibrating through my bones. I tried to back away, but my legs wouldn't move. That's when the figure raised a hand, pointing directly at me. It didn't need to speak. I could feel the words inside my head, echoing in the emptiness. "You were never supposed to see this." I froze, my mind racing, trying to make sense of what it meant. I wasn't supposed to see what? The maps, the territories, the thing in the sky. My brain was on fire, grasping at straws, trying to connect the dots. Then, in a flash, it hit me. The territories. They weren't just random patches of land. They were borders, boundaries, dividing lines between our world and something else. And I had been hired, no, manipulated, into mapping those borders, into breaching the places where the lines between worlds were weakest. The territories I'd mapped weren't empty. They were doorways, cracks in the fabric of reality. And now, they were open. I had let them in. The figure took a step closer, and I felt the ground beneath me shift. I wasn't standing on glass. I was standing on the skin of something massive, something ancient, something that had been sleeping for a very long time. I looked down and saw the surface ripple, like the skin of some enormous creature, breathing beneath me. The figures in the distance, the ones that had been stalking me in the real world, were moving again, emerging from the shadows. But this time, they weren't just watching, they were coming for me. I could feel the ground shifting beneath my feet, the weight of the unseen things above pressing down on me. The figure reached out again, and I realized too late that it wasn't pointing at me. It was pointing behind me. I turned, and what I saw made my blood run cold. The map, the one I had been working on, was there in the sky above me, hanging like a projection. But it wasn't just the map. It was alive. The lines I had drawn, the territories I had mapped, they were moving, converging, merging into one. And at the center of that convergence was a shape, a form, twisting and pulsing with energy. It was me, or at least it was something that looked like me, made from the same shifting, formless matter as the figures. It had my outline, my shadow, but no features, no face, just a blank, empty version of me, standing there, staring back. The hum in the air reached a deafening pitch, vibrating through every cell in my body, and I realized then what was happening. The maps hadn't just been tracking these territories, they had been tracking me, mapping me. And now, the thing I had created, this empty, featureless version of myself, was coming to take my place. I tried to scream, to run, but it was too late. The ground beneath me collapsed, and I felt myself falling into the endless dark. I don't remember how I got back. I woke up on my apartment floor, gasping for air, drenched in sweat. The laptop was still open in front of me, the map frozen on the screen. The territories were still there, but they were no longer moving. They were locked in place, as if the program had shut down. I scrambled to my feet, my body aching, my head spinning. It felt like I had been hit by a truck. The first thing I did was rip the power cord from the laptop and slam it shut. I wanted to throw it out the window, burn it, anything to get it out of my life. But something stopped me. When I opened it again, the map was gone. TerraVision had deleted itself. It's been weeks now, and I haven't told anyone what happened. The figures stopped appearing, and the strange hum in the air is gone. Everything is normal, at least on the surface. But I can't shake the feeling that I've left a door open, that I've seen something I wasn't supposed to. The maps are still out there. I know they are. And sometimes, late at night, when the world is quiet, I hear that faint hum again, like a distant whisper, calling me back. I don't know how much longer I can ignore it.